thank you again. We're really honored to have the opportunity to even sponsor the Women Leaders Breakfast, the very first inaugural one. Just a little background on myself. As Bruce said, I am the Vice President of the Bay Area. I'm actually Alaska Airlines Group's very first senior officer based in California. But I'm happy to share that I'm actually one of 3 Asian American females of 30 officers for Alaska Airlines Group. And my other colleagues actually head up our marketing division. So all of the fun marketing stuff that you see here and you see on the billboards and you see on the Ford Go bikes, that is the brainchild of Sangeeta. And our CIO, Charu, is also an Asian American female. And so we are, I think, making a lot of progress as an airline. 40% of our board is made up of females, so our board of directors for Alaska Airlines Group. And we recognize why that's so important. As Alaska Airlines is growing its presence in the Bay Area, we have to reflect the diversity of our city and our community. And actually, it was amazing when I was looking up stats to demonstrate why diversity and inclusion is so important. I showed to our chief commercial officer, hey, fully one third of the San Francisco Bay Area is made up of Asians. 1/3 are foreign born. So how we market here, how we reach out to the community, how we develop as leaders is totally different than what we may have known in the past. And that's an exciting opportunity for all of us here as executives, as leaders in our community. What I also wanted to share was actually a really good anecdote about why this is the case. So I was at the airport the other day, and I saw an elderly couple. They were speaking Mandarin, and they were clearly very lost, and they were trying to get from one gate to the next. And unfortunately, my Mandarin's not very good, but I wanted to go over and help. And luckily, someone else swooped in, and it was actually an Alaska Airlines crew member who had flawless Mandarin, trying to get our passengers from one gate to the next. And that probably happens multiple times a day, if not in a few hours. And I think that is a really good example of why we need leadership, why we need to have inclusion. So it's not just diversity and inclusion, it is leadership. And that is a really exciting thing. And I commend the Asia Society for pulling this together, not only here on the West Coast, but on the East Coast as well. And I want to share just a little anecdote from last year. Last year, I invited a few of my Lyft colleagues to come and join when I was attending. And as a result of the conversations and the discussions that took place here, Lyft actually launched our very first Asian American employee resource group. And that's an exciting thing because they were inspired by the folks that they heard here. They made connections with other employee resource groups to get best practices, to get ideas, to get a sense of how do we make this work for us. And so there is a lot of great connections to be made, a lot of great ideas to be born here today, and we're really thrilled to be a part of it. I also wanted to share, you may have gotten a fun little discount card on your way in or hopefully on your way out. As I mentioned, as Alaska Airlines grows, we have actually launched 40 new nonstop routes in just 2017 alone. So that little discount card will hopefully get you to where you want to go, and we're, again, honored to be here. I am also going to be introducing our next speaker, Katie Benner of New York Times. Is she here yet? Oh, perfect. Hi, Katie. And Katie, I just want to share, actually has a really incredible background. Not only is she the Silicon Valley writer for the New York Times, she's written for Fortune before, and you've also lived in Beijing and wrote for a weekly column for the Beijing Review. That's so right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'd love to bring the panelists for the first part of our conversation this morning, Bucky and Melissa Abad, up onto the stage. So Buck joined Cisco with its 2004 acquisition of Andiamo Systems, where he was president and CEO. He became vice president and general manager of the data center business unit, and then he retired in 2008. But in 2010, Buck co-founded the Advanced Leadership Program for Asian American Executives, which is an education program at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. and he's also a co-founder of the Corporate Executive Initiative, which is a national network of Asian American executives. And he teaches executive leadership workshops for Ascend, a pan-Asian professional organization. So, Buck, it's so nice to have you.
Glad to be here.
And to my left, Melissa Abad. Melissa is a researcher at the Clayman Institute and the Center for the Advancement of Women's Leadership. Melissa has a PhD in sociology from the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she examined the career paths of immigrant-serving nonprofit professionals in the suburbs. Her research focuses on how organizational behavior and community context shape the options women and men have, and finds that there are gendered, racialized differences. I'm sure everybody in this room is nodding, going, yes, that's exactly true. So we're here with Buck and Melissa to kick off the conversation and talk a little bit about the data behind the rest of the day that you're going to have. What is found in the research and maybe why those numbers exist. So I thought we could start with Buck because he's crunched a lot of numbers. He's gone through EEOC data and found what he calls the bamboo ceiling. Buck, could you just talk a little bit about that and what those numbers are?
And I make that point because I want to be sure that we focus on the racial aspect of the problem. So getting back to the data, so I'll start at the top level. I'll say it this way. For both Asian men and Asian women, we are for the men, the most likely to be hired, but least likely to be promoted into middle management executive levels, at lower rates than any other race. For Asian women, the most likely hired of any women, and again, the least likely of any women, in fact, any cohort to be promoted into middle management or executive levels. So the problem doesn't exist. If there's a problem for women, and there is, the problem is for Asian women, is more of a racial issue. In fact, you look at the gaps between, you look at the executive gaps between women. Okay? The only women that have actually made progress, if we look at the data from 2007 to 2015, the only progress really has accumulated to white women. Black, Hispanic, and minority women have made virtually no gains in those 10 years. So women have made progress in tech. Okay? White women have. Minority women have made no progress. Similarly with minority men, actually, same thing. Very little progress. Of any cohort, the only cohort making progress with regard to the quote glass ceiling or bamboo ceiling really is because of the women's movement, okay, and gender and the focus on gender. But all of that is accumulated to white women. What we haven't been missing really is a discussion of minority women and their problem with the glass ceiling.
Got it. So, Buck, you had said earlier that over that time period, that about a decade that you looked at those numbers, white women went from 17% underrepresented in management positions to 17% overrepresented in management positions, and that there was little change in the numbers for Black, Hispanic, or Asian women. So, Melissa, I'm wondering if you could try to explain to us why these numbers exist. Buck went through, he crunched the data, this is what he found. What is driving this?
Hi, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. There's a few things driving this, right? I think it starts, the easy answer is a pipeline, right? And Buck mentioned this. I also want to add, I'm in the middle of a project where I'm interviewing women of color in tech and finance throughout the pipeline, right? And so one of the common answers when this comes up is, oh, it's a pipeline issue, there aren't enough. Or to Buck's point, there are so many Asians getting engineering degrees and getting MBAs that of course it makes sense that they're going to be largely represented. However, what I'm looking at is what happens after they get hired. So one issue is who's getting hired, who's deemed smart enough, right? The other question is leadership. What does a leader look like in tech, right? And so what happens is people don't say that, they'll list qualities, right, about cultural fit, but cultural fit has become sort of an excuse or a mask to talk about, not to talk about race and not to talk about gender. And so it's really to piggyback off what Buck is saying. Yes, when we're talking about diversity in tech, what I'm learning in the 10 months I've been here is that diversity is code for gender. And yes, there are gender disparities. I don't want to discredit that. However, it's not just gender. It's how race and gender interact. And so for women of color, they can't just choose one. And so what's been nice about my role at the Clayman Institute is I've been able to go to events around women and that talk about how women are cracking that glass ceiling. But what's fascinating to me, especially being in California, is the lack of racial diversity, is a lack of attention to talking about women of color. We can talk about women's progress, but when I go to events and the panel is predominantly white and the conversation is about gender and not race, I think you're missing a huge part of California's population when you're talking about diversity and solely focusing on women.
Now, Melissa and Buck, could you maybe each give an example of a cultural description, the way that tech talks about culture, something, a description of a leader that is inadvertently racially coded that would keep Asians from advancing in the workplace?
So I have a slightly different perspective on that, but that's okay. But let me answer it another way. Part of the problem that Asians face, in particular Asian women face, is there really is, and I believe this, and I've seen this, is implicit bias. But I argue this: the reason there is implicit bias, that is to say, the bias that Asians are great workers but not great leaders. And I would argue that a lot of the reason for that is because non-Asians see behaviors that suggest non-leadership potential. Being quiet, being differential, right? And so that's a problem, because when you are a leader, and I was a vice president, general manager, you can't be shy. You can't. You got to state your opinion. You got to defend yourself. You got to be able to argue. Okay? And if you can't do that, then you're not going to get that promotion. So there is a cultural gap between Western manager style and a lot of Asian characteristics. And promotion into the executive suite is not a reward for doing the job you're doing. It is observation of characteristics they think you can bring to the next level. And if you can't, and they don't see that, you don't get that opportunity. And a lot of Asians don't understand that. It is not a reward. You have to show that you can be a leader. You have to show that you can defend yourself, because there are a lot of strong egos in that room at that level. So there is implicit bias because people perceive people not being leaders, and there are enough, and we all know this is the stereotype is true enough for people to form those opinions.
So when it comes to cultural fit, yes, outspoken, engaging, team player, all these sort of ambiguous terminologies, right? That's great, okay. But what about these different kinds of leadership, right? So I've interviewed 7 Asian women, most of whom are immigrants. And what I'm finding is they're really great at skills, right? They have their credentials, they've gone to the right schools, and they do the work, and they love the work, right? I think when Buck and I did an event at Clayman about a month and a half ago, when I talk about this, I think the problem is Asian women in tech, right, because that's what we're talking about, love their jobs. But why doesn't their job love them? And put them in the pipeline towards leadership. And so what I'm learning from them is I love the work, but when I become a mother, I have to make a decision. I can't go out for beers after work, right? I think what's also interesting, because I've been interviewing immigrants and I couching this in my broad knowledge of immigrant professionals, is accent's an issue, right? Because sometimes if people don't have an Anglo accent, right, they're not read as smart, right? And we can talk about foosball, or we can talk about, right, the bro culture that is dominant in tech culture, and how that facilitates relationship building, how that facilitates networks, how that facilitates finding mentors, finding sponsors, right? And if you don't engage with the people who are doing the coding, right, what's been fascinating to me as I have conversations with Asian professionals, it's like, there's so many of us, they take us for granted, right? And they don't know the knowledge we bring to the table. And as a result, because they become invisible, and a lot of women of color experience this hypervisibility and invisibility at the same time, they have to figure out how to negotiate that. And for me, what I'm learning, because I have more knowledge on the experiences of Black and Hispanic women versus Asian, is that there's different decisions being made about how they understand that visibility versus invisibility. I'm still in the middle of making sense of it, But I just want to highlight that there's different conversations about how the different groups of women of color navigate this visibility versus invisibility challenge that they face at work.
Can you give us one example? Not, we don't have to go through the the entire thing, but just one example that you are finding over and over again.
One example of what?
Of how they navigate this invisibility versus hypervisibility issue.
They don't. They just get the work. I remember I asked one of my respondents, I asked her, well, what are your long-term career goals? Well, I don't want to be management because I don't like working with people. And I was like, I didn't even go there, right? Like, I didn't even ask you that. And so, and to me, I thought, really? Like, how, what's your aversion to management? And two, there are other things to do to climb the ladder. And so for the others who are a little bit more like, I want to be CIO or I want to be CFO, it's more about, I'm just going to keep going and hopefully it'll pay off, right? And I think for some of the women where it's flipped, it's in the hands of the organization, right? So I had one woman who talked about when she was raising her children, she had a 10-year stall because she was working part-time. And she was doing the work and she was delivering, even though she was working at 60%, she was delivering 100%. No one talked about promotion. No one talked about rewarding her for delivering what an 100% person would be doing. And then when the organization developed clear criteria about the benchmark she had to hit to climb, she went from being an underperformer to an exceptional performer. And nothing changed about her behavior. What changed was what the organization decided to evaluate and developing clear criteria to make sure that the employees were being evaluated correctly.
So I have a question I have a question for you, Buck. And but what it sounds like is what you found is that Asian women were abdicating their power. They were either saying, I'm opting out altogether, don't want to be part of this, don't want to be management, want to ignore it, or they were abdicating their power to the organization and putting their entire career development in the organization's hands. So, Buck, as somebody who was a manager and a leader at Cisco,
I just want to clear. I don't think that's not what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
I think that's the danger of how we interpret like different groups of people is that they're abdicating their power. They're not abdicating their power. I would argue any other person would make that decision. So the difference is that there are certain groups that will be recognized regardless of whether or not they're visible. Right?
Got it.
It's just that women of color, because they're already not in these informal circles, right, and don't know the language of how to navigate these informal spaces as tools to promote themselves, then they don't. It's like you don't know what you don't know. So it's not abdicating their power. It's more like a consciousness or an awareness of how to navigate the informal rules that aren't explained.
So, Buck, what is the company's role at Cisco? What did you do about this situation?
So I'll, before I answer that question, a couple of comments on your comment.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of abdicating power, I would say we're at. Good way to say this. Part of the reason that we haven't made progress as an Asian community is that it is a lot of our fault. You know, we are not complaining. And in terms of advocating, yes, we are advocating a claim on any change, right? I was at, I won't tell you which company, a very big company in Silicon Valley about a couple months ago, and we're talking about putting together a training program for Asian potentials. And there's a comment that was made that says it's hard to push this inside the company because in the annual reviews we do, Asians are the happiest group in the company. You know, so they don't need any change, right? Everybody else is complaining, and so in a lot of ways, it's our community's fault. It's for not saying we want more, we're not asking for more. It's also in the other part is also I've always believed this is that by and large a lot of Asian leaders have abdicated their responsibility as community leaders in pushing for that. Okay, and that's a problem that we have generically in most companies. There are a few here and there, but we don't have the momentum that other minorities do in advocating for change.
And I would argue that a lot of that has to do with knowledge of the power of structure and culture in shaping outcomes, right? So when I think of the knowledge I have on like the experience of Black and Hispanic professionals in the workplace versus the things I'm learning about Asians, when I talked, whether it's my friends, whether it's the people I've interviewed, it's like, I'm not supposed to belong here, right? So I have to fight that. So that's developed that for Blacks and Hispanics, it almost gives them a set of tools already walking in the door. When you're right? The Asian American paradox. There's sociological literature talks about this. They're high academic achievers. When you look at immigrant integration and how the different groups compare to whites, Asians outperform whites in everything when it comes to school. At work, it's a completely different story, and no one understands why.
That's because the skills are different. The skills are different.
Right. That's what I'm saying. It's the organizational culture,
right.
And it's like the rules. The rules that it takes to do well at school do not apply at work.
So it almost sounds like you walk in the door and you get blindsided in the workplace.
Yes.
She's like, I did so well in school. Why am I not doing well now? And they have no tools to understand. They're in a defensive position from the go. They think that they are actually in an elevated position because they did well in school.
And a lot of times with immigrant communities, regardless of national origin, it's like we're taught to work hard, and working hard is going to get us to the top.
So
that's not. But it's
I just got the notice we have to wrap in about 2 minutes, so I just need to queue up the next panelists who are going to be speaking, so if you guys could just make sure that you're ready to get up on stage. But the last question for you two then, quickly, would be, then what works? Do we see any data, any evidence that there is a method that works in terms of integrating and developing leadership skills and elevating Asian American women in the workplace? What does the data tell us?
So I have two answers. First of all, if you look at the data, nothing has worked. Okay, I mean there's been
Great.
no, I'm serious. If you look at the numbers, a three-part answer. If you look at the numbers from 2007, 2015, the absolute numbers have gone up, and so people think there's progress. But if you look at the relative numbers in terms of Asians in the workforce, there's been no change in relative representation. So there's nothing's working. Second question, though, is it's clear that something's working because white women have gone from I think 13% underrepresented to about 13% overrepresented at the same time frame. So there are things that work. The questions are not being applied to us. So somehow we have to leverage on those programs because either we're not partaking of them, or not applied to us, but there's something can work. Third thing is awareness works. That is, say, anytime we go into a company, okay, and raise the question about the Asian glass ceiling, upper management says, let's do something. So you see the first part there. So the first part is awareness, okay, and integration into programs that will do something. That's what I think. But it's too early to tell gross numbers.
I think. So I'm part of the data collection process. I think one is get the data, right, on what's actually happening. And Buck did a great job of crunching the numbers, but the numbers are one piece of the story. It's a snapshot. The next part, which is literally what I'm working on right now, is collecting the stories. Because it's understanding the processes that go behind those numbers that will help us develop programming. Because I think, to your point, yes, the programming around gender inclusion, the gender pipeline, is a very strong program in a lot of tech companies. However, it's not being informed by the intersection of race and gender. And when we start to think about how to create change, my argument is we start at the intersection. What does it look like for Asian women, for Hispanic women, for Black women? What are the similarities and what are the differences? And then when we talk about those things, then we can tailor the programs that exist to actually meet the needs of the variety of people in these workplaces.
All right. Thank you so much, you two. This was really fascinating. Now we're going to hear some of the stories from women in the workplace and to see how all the things that we just discussed play out in their real lives. So thank you so much. Let's see. Who else we're missing? Hi. And we have one more person. Hi. Come on up. No, we have Tina. No. Okay. Sure. Interesting. All right. So. Sure. That's fine. We're going to. So it looks like what we're going to. First of all, let's hold on and do something on these chairs. Do you mind moving your stool over so we can be closer together? We're just going to visually make this work, and then I just need each of you to share a microphone. So at the end, up here. Thank you so much. We're going to make this technology work. So I think that let's kick this off by having each of you. Thank you so much. Having each of you just give a very brief introduction of yourselves, your name and your job, and where you are in your career development. Managing director, owner of the company, etc., just so that everybody gets a sense for who's on the panel today. Why don't you start?
Hi, I'm Shirley Ma. I manage our inclusion efforts at McKinsey & Company for North American women and for Asian Americans.
Hi everyone, I'm C.A. Landberg. I'm from Google. I'm based in Mountain View. I manage the Play operations, apps operations for Google. I've been in Google for almost 5 years now.
Hi everyone, I'm Karen T. I work for Singapore's Prime Minister's Office. I am setting up the Smart Cities International team out here in SF.
Hi, I'm Tina Lee. I'm the founder and executive director of Mother Coders, which is a nonprofit that helps moms get careers in tech. I'm from San Francisco, native.
Fantastic. So thank you so much all for being here. And I was wondering, so what we've heard a lot about is this idea that Asian American or Asian women in American companies, let me rephrase that, Asian women in American companies have not made management advancements because a lot of Asian women in American companies are not Asian American and did not come from a traditional Asian American background. So I was actually really hoping that we could talk a little bit about that, sort of look at the fact that there is a majority-minority feel to this, and that sometimes in other contexts we are actually in the majority and we don't face some of the issues that Buck and Melissa just talked about. So actually I was wondering if you might start, you're working at a Singaporean company. When we spoke on the phone, you discussed that some of the issues that we're going to be looking at throughout the day are things you've managed to avoid working for a Singaporean company. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why that is.
Sure, so some background on myself. I went to college here. I grew up in Singapore, I went to college here. Went back to Singapore, worked for the government. I had a bond period of service with them, and then moved back out here as part of a posting. So I worked for the Singapore government basically for my career. And when I came out here, I found women's issues fascinating because I didn't feel that they resonated with me. I never had to change myself, or gender was never part of my identity back in Singapore. So coming out here, though, really made me reflect on suddenly becoming a minority in two ways. Firstly, I am international Singaporean women here. I have an accent. Secondly, I work for a highly technical team now, and I'm not engineering trained. And so when I became a minority, I started to realize all sorts of things about how I had to shift my behavior. So on the part of being international and having to build out my network here from scratch, I realized that there's this cultural thing that screams against it. It's like, in Singapore, there's this culture of don't stand out, don't stick out and don't publicize yourself, and networking is kind of sleazy. That's kind of the cultural undertone. And because I straddle the two worlds, and whatever happens on my social media gets to Singaporeans, sometimes my friends are like, what are you doing? And I do feel that, and it does come with some sort of shame, right? Because that's the cultural expectation. And so that really made me realize, minorities, I don't face women's issues, but yeah, minorities' issues are to some extent similar. And moving to a technical organization, I find myself being pretty apologetic, like, I'm not an engineer, but, and I realized, why should I do that, right? I come from a different background, bring different values, a different type of value, but equally important. So I think as a minority, sometimes you tend to be apologetic. There's all these cultural narratives that takes a lot to get over. And I really wonder, how similar are minority issues to women issues, and how different are they?
Sure. And Shia, you and I talked about this a little bit, this idea that there are cultural things that keep people from behaving exactly as they should in a workplace to optimize their potential to move ahead. And how much of this is the workplace's responsibility to address? You're at a huge company, Google. How much of it is Google's responsibility to address?
Well, I personally feel really responsible for all my org and reports. Like, I need to promote all of them. That's what I feel personally. But I think in general as a society, both need to, bear the burden, meaning the individuals need to be aware, like Buck was saying earlier, aware of the environment, aware of the stats, what they're doing and not doing. Like, for example, the culture of respect and humility sometimes really get in the way of negotiation for promotion or salary or positions or opportunities. Right? But if individuals just keep pushing, like no one wants to do it, right? You get tired, right? Why do you have to work 10 hours a day and then negotiate with the boss? Why you are great for the org and all of that, right? Both should do that too, right? So I think each managers, anyone in the management or leadership position should be aware of the biases and what the opportunities that they can provide to them. I try to give rotation opportunity to my Asian members to come to Mountain View, or Mountain View members to go to Asia. That would foster the inclusion and that would foster cultural understanding. I think in the corporate level, though, in Google, we constantly hear about unconscious biases, like busting biases, diversity and inclusion. Not so much centered around Asians, always, because Asians are happy, as we talked earlier. But I think that sentiment is definitely increasing, and I feel really encouraged personally as an Asian too, that company and leadership is really aware of that and trying to support it from the top.
Sure.
So I think it needs to happen both ways.
Sure. And Tina, so it's so interesting because we've talked about all of these issues in the context of a large corporation. And in Silicon Valley, there's nothing more prized than entrepreneurialism, than this idea that you might start at a Google or you might start at a Facebook, but eventually you're going to break out and start your own company. How do you think being Asian and being female has impacted your ability to start Mother Coders and to do everything from network to raise money to build out your business?
Hi. So I want to make a clarification. I didn't start out starting a for-profit company. I went and started a nonprofit. And so my challenges might be a little bit different. But what I do feel is the same forces that prevent women or are acting as barriers for women to getting capital, to getting into networks, where there is capital, and just having the time to go out and do all the extracurricular things that would help you make relationships. As a mom, that's just not on the table for me. Mm-hmm. So as I've moved through my career, what I found was, yes, there was always racism. Yes, there was always sexism. Yes, as a Asian American woman, I was always used as a model minority. Sometimes, I'm not enough of this, or sometimes I'm too good for that. And so it's been challenging. But once I became a mom, I think that was the most I have ever felt that my identity suddenly had a huge impact on my career opportunities. And I found that the motherhood penalty, right, affects women across all socioeconomic backgrounds and races. So I just honed in on that because I found that was what was equalizing, and even for white women, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why I decided to start Mother Coders, and I honed in on tech because that was my background, and it's the future. So if we're going to change the calculus and the dynamics, right, that's where I want to empower women.
Right. Got it. And Shirley, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, a moment when you understood or realized the impact that race was having on your career and what that was like, and how did you deal with the situation?
It has happened over and over. So I've been a big career hopper. I'm like the classic millennial. So the first thing I did is went and ran a nonprofit in Canada, where my identity, so every time I switch jobs, which is about 1 to 2 years rotation, I'll just sit there and write down everything that comes to mind in terms of my identity, and then I'll say to myself, which of these is most salient right now? And in Canada, it was being the American. I was the first elected American president of this nonprofit, and there's a lot of pushback to that. I went on to running the same nonprofit in Asia Pacific, and then I was the Asian American. All the Asians were like, "You're not Asian enough," and how did you get this job running Asia Pacific nonprofits? And then I went to the Middle East, where actually when people see Asians, they're typically servants. Some of my friends would joke and be like, "You look just like my servant." And I'm like, I don't know how to joke back to that. And on top of that, in the Middle East, if you're a woman and you're a foreigner, there's certain implications as well, right? So it's been a kind of a constant redefining myself. I've also switched sectors from nonprofit. I led a nonprofit, then I worked briefly at the White House, and now I'm at McKinsey in the business sector. So I'm constantly how do I talk about who I am and how are people even viewing me? But so I think coming back to the U.S., this is my first U.S.-based full-time job, and it was the first time being a woman of color actually hit me. When I was working in the Netherlands, being Asian didn't feel like such a minority. There weren't so many minorities, right? And so you do feel it here. You look upwards and you think gosh, there's so many of us. but who's in the C-suite? I don't see myself represented. So it's been like pretty much every other year that I think like about how being a woman of color is impacting my experience.
And how important is it to see that representation in the C-suite? You know, for on a day-to-day basis, how often do you think about the fact that you're not seeing minority faces at an executive level? Sure. Yeah, I was going to say you can each take a crack at it.
So the first job I had, I became the regional vice president of a region, and then I became president of a nonprofit. And it wasn't until I came back to the U.S. where my mind wasn't like, how do I get to the top of this organization? It was like a really subtle, like, what am I thinking? And then I remember getting staffed to my first project with an Asian woman, and I then realized it. I was like, oh my gosh, I thought like you're a unicorn to me. I didn't realize. I was so excited. The interesting part of the effect, though, so at McKinsey we do this Women in the Workplace report with Lean In and in partnership, and we survey over 200 companies, and we ask people, men and women, and we and also they're disclosing their race. What are your experiences and what's your ambition? The crazy thing is the ambition level for Asian women and for all women of color is higher than that of white women. Right? So it's like such a testament to the resilience, knowing that when you look at the next set of data, which is, do I have people pounding the table for me? Lower, it's just like a much lower representation, right? So there's just such a resilience of ambition among the group, which is, as somebody running a company, a huge opportunity in terms of talent.
And Shia, you looked like you had something to say there.
So I think it's really important to have leaders like C-suite or VP level, EVP level, that as Asian person and also Asian women. And I have a couple of VPs I always go to, like, to mentor me, and if I bump into the problem. And to be honest, when I started career, I was very, very ignorant. I didn't even think about identity. I didn't think about me as a woman or Asian, or I just focused on the work and value that I'm providing back to the company, which worked well for me. But then, I became director at Google, and I can't remember how many people, but at least a couple of dozen asked me, how did you become a director of Google in headquarters as a Japanese woman who speaks funky English? I'm like, well, I don't know what to say to that, and it just kind of, I made it somehow, but but I don't think I'm ending my career anywhere soon, anytime soon. And I have the ambition I want to achieve. I want to inspire people. I want to help people in the world, and that doesn't have anything to do with me becoming director or my identity. But then I start to think, well, but I really need to visualize what I want to be, in 10 years or in 20 years. And if there is no one to look up to, it's really, really hard to visualize it. Mm-hmm. And I realized, okay, well, I have some responsibility to all, there, that I have to show that this is my role, and this is my ideal role that I'm playing, and I'm giving value back to the company. And you guys don't need to follow me, but this is one of the examples, and you can see it and visualize it. So in that respect, I think it's really, really important to have at least people 2 levels up from you that you can think as role models. But then you can think, oh, well, okay, this is how you can make it work. You don't need to work 20 hours a day, right? So those are the things. I think it's really important for each individual. And then as a company, we get a lot more powerful if we can utilize everyone and, empower everyone to the full potential. So.
Karen or Tina?
For me, I was majority in Singapore, women leadership, very normal in my organization, top levels, every level, mothers up there, and it was just I never thought about it. But when I came to this experience out here, I started thinking back on all my colleagues who were minorities, right? Either racial minorities or educational minorities, because in Singapore, one of the things that is discriminatory is, do you have a degree? And if you don't, for a long time, you just couldn't progress as fast. And the majorities would say things that, we didn't even think were issues at all. So I had a boss who would come in and say, oh, which university were you from? And then the one person who did it would be he felt really bad about it, And maybe my colleagues who are Muslim, they can't go out with us for lunch. And what impact would that be, right, on them? And I realized that I realized all these things I didn't think were big issues were probably huge issues for them, and the organization has to think of ways to almost overcompensate for that. And I think that has been my reflection very much in the last year. Oh, I didn't even know how horrible it is to be a minority. Now let me think about all the ways my organization needs to overcompensate for that and stop talking in terms of those categories. And I've been sharing with them these thoughts as well.
So I'm a big Maslow's hierarchy of needs person, right? And if you think about base needs, right, your physiological needs, and then your psychological needs, and then the sense of belonging, and then fulfillment. To be a leader, you need to be in that fulfillment. That's at the top, right? So it's not always linear, but I would say that usually that's the case. So for companies, if you want to cultivate leadership, you have to create an environment where people feel a sense of belonging before they can reach the next level, right? And in the context of America, our companies, I heard this great saying yesterday, was that this is the last space where we feel like it's the American neighborhood, right? Work. So we have to figure out a way to help people feel a sense of belonging, and I think having leadership at the top that reflects who you are, it gives you a sense of like what the possibilities are. It's a signal that that's a possibility for me. And that seed of like, hey, if I worked hard or emulated this person or that person, you know, this is something that's possible for me, I think is critical to getting someone to see the top and go to that self-fulfillment level.
And we're going to start taking audience questions. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. We have people with microphones who are happy to take it. If there's a question now, are there? And if not, be thinking of your questions, and I'm going to move back to the panel. One thing that I found in my reporting, as I'm sure everybody who's watched the news in 2017 knows, there has been a huge conversation about sexual harassment and bullying in the workplace. It is taking powerful men out of jobs. It has sparked conversations I never thought in my lifetime we would have. And one of the things that I found in reporting those stories here in Silicon Valley is that a huge majority of the women who were harassed or bullied were women of color. And one of the interesting things that I found also in that reporting is that when I would reach out to different women in the community and say, well, what do you know about this man? Almost, not always, but oftentimes lots of white women would say, I think he's great. He's really wonderful. And these are women with really robust professional networks. And then I would talk to women of color who would say, I don't know, I've heard these things, or actually this horrible thing happened to me. I had no one to talk to. And the thing that I was so struck by was that there was not a network. Even the whisper network amongst women of color was not as strong as it was amongst white women around things like harassment or bullying. So I'm wondering if you all have thought much about this, if you've thought about what it takes to build out that network. Is it important to you? What lengths have you gone to create that network for yourselves? And if not, you know, why not?
Maybe I'll start a little bit. So when I first came out, one of my roles is to really cultivate the network of Singaporeans out here. And we would, whenever ministers or high-level people would pass through, we would call, who wants to come? And there were, maybe one woman out of 20, or at most 5%. And I started asking around, being like, hey, are there no Singaporean women in tech? And some people were like, yeah, at most you'll find 5 or 10. And I was like, I can't be. So, one time I decided, let's just do an all-women's event. And within the first day, I think 60 people signed up. And they were like, oh, and my friend, and my friend, and my friend. And that made me think, like, why do women not come why do they not come when it's like an open event, and come in full force when it's a women's event? And then we opened the event up to men also, the next round, and then men came, but women came in greater force. So, open question for me, but I find when I ask them, why don't you come, they say, well, we're not sure what's going to be discussed. Is it going to be a man-blaming thing? We don't really want to go there. It's not really constructive. Some women said that in their companies, if there's a very heavy women's agenda, they start to see everything through that lens, and they didn't find it helpful. But what I found useful was to just help them to connect at that deeper level. So one question I asked the panel, there were 5 women, was, what is one mindset as a Singaporean woman in the tech sector that has helped you, and what is one that has hindered you? And oh my gosh, that conversation just exploded. And people just felt, oh, I'm not alone. All the problems that I'm facing are not personal. They're actually quite structural, quite built into just my experience as an international woman here. And I think that was extremely helpful for them, and the community just started building from their relationship perform. And I think that's one lens that I've approached it from, just getting people to connect at that level.
And Shirley or Shia?
Yeah, I can take this. So I facilitated several trainings in Google, right? The one is called Stretch. It's for women leadership, like fostering women leadership for the next generation leaders. And I was in APAC. I was based in Tokyo office at that time, and I traveled to all the cities in Asia, like Seoul, Shanghai, Beijing, Taipei, to facilitate this training. The reason is because there are not enough trainers who can train this material in Asia. So, and then it's like 20 people or 30 people, 30 women talking about like opportunities, bamboo sharing, what's blocking them, institutional barriers, their awareness, how to be intentional, and all those things, and tips and things. But what was most helpful there is like discussion among the peer group. And they never had that. They need to with each other, like in work relationship. But it's hard to share any personal stories or any personal struggle. They are respectful of each other's time. They don't know if it's going to be solved. They could be introverted. But just putting this training up and giving them safe and open space to converse with each other really opened up this community. And it's a strong community now in Google. And then this cohort of 20, 30 people can always help each other. That's the premise of the class. So I thought this kind of like vision, like we have to create this kind of forum or panel. And we recently also created another ERG called TalkPath, which is targeting Asians. Not to talk about like Asians in general, but like what challenges Asians could face in the corporate world. So those things need to be intentional, take manpower. People need to kind of join forces, but you know what? It really helps each other. Like it helps you too. I contribute a lot to these programs, and it takes lots of my time. But what I get from the return from the community really like inspire me and help me. So I think each one of us need to kind of be intentional about how can we set up safe forum? How can we set up this open community that people are willing to just casually jump in and get value out of it and want to return the value to the community.
Absolutely. Was there a question in the audience? Yes. In the back.
Hi, my name is Ashley from the Mayor's Office of San Francisco. I really connect with you, all the stories that you've told. One of the things I wanted to ask all of you in the panel is that have you had a chance to talk to your upper management about policies in regards to promoting women? I think that would be a good goal to have, and that would at least would give the minority a chance to work towards a goal.
Sure. Shirley, do you want to start with this? Since you've had...
This is my job. I don't even know where to start. The first thing is, and when I work with companies, it's like if you care about it, you got to put some money behind it, and you got to put some goals behind it. That's the first thing. That's how everything else runs in business, right? So I'll talk to a company, enormous companies, and they'll say like, oh, well, we've got ERGs, and some people out of hide help them. That doesn't get to longitudinal, hardcore, super helpful data sets. That doesn't get to accountability, right? So I think there's a piece around getting the institution basics in place, right? The leading companies, and even when we look across, by the way, companies that, so there's, the data, when you look at data when it comes to diversity, it can be pretty emotional and sad because it's a really long journey. But the really hopeful thing is that when we saw companies that prioritized gender and diversity together, you'll often see we saw 100% of our tech companies in our data set said gender was a top priority, but a lower than industry average said that race was. Right, so I think there's a big piece around the very top leaders of the organization actually realizing that anything besides gender is diversity. I think that's been mentioned. And I'd say the last thing, I have so many thoughts, but the big thing I think that we're talking a ton about is allies, right? Like just putting all the weight on women or women of color or black men to be the ones to drive promotion and progression for everybody. We know sponsorship matters. We know you need people pounding the tables for you. I don't think when I'm coaching offices that if they don't have super senior men on their council focused on women, that they're set up for success, right? It's when we asked men, do you prioritize gender? they were less likely to, first off. But really shocking, 15% said their company focusing on gender could inhibit their own career advancement. So we, like there's actually like a fear. So we really got to start a good dialogue in terms of the fact that this is, business priority.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Another question?
Can I just?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
I just want to highlight your comment on allyship and getting powerful men. My friend Valerie Aurora is with me today. She's from Frameshift Consulting. She has taken a completely different approach, an approach that I think is sorely needed. She actually teaches people to become allies. She actually empowers the allies with tools and policies and even language on how to defend and then also promote policies that will engender more equality. So I just want to call that out and say that it is happening, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because having a powerful white male sponsor is like a dream goal of personally just me. So if anyone wants to. I'm open.
There are only a couple of white men in the audience, but you were just pitched a job, basically. Any other audience questions? Yes, sure. Yes, you'll get a microphone.
Thanks. Andrew Ackle, ally, he for she.
Yay!
My question is unconscious bias, particularly around recruitment and retention. There's a lot of companies that are starting up in this space around creating kind of merit-based hiring. Do you think that's positive, or do you think that's negative? One of the positive aspects, right, is it's blind and you should be getting merit-based employees. One of the negatives is we may not be addressing the biases that may exist out there. So wanted to kind of get your thoughts.
I think it's interesting to go to the example of universities instead of businesses, and I'll just use mine as an example. I went to a small New England liberal arts college, all white, in the 90s, and they had such a hard time getting minorities to stay. They had a lot of recruitment programs, and they wanted people very badly, but they could not keep them, and they realized that actually bringing African American and Asian students to the middle of Maine wasn't enough. They actually had to think about what their lives were like and set them up for success, and spend tremendous amount of time, money, resources, and staff to say, how do we make you feel comfortable here because you are in the minority? It was a harsh reality after a decade of failure. So I think that business is facing something really similar. Companies like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, these huge companies where the diversity numbers aren't changing, but they're seeing tremendous turnover amongst minorities. It's like, well, is it enough just to go to an HBCU and get a bunch of African American people and put them here? Probably not, because we're not setting them up for success. We have so many Asian men and women in our companies. They're overrepresented, but how come they're not moving forward? And I think that the companies are asking those questions.
I actually...
go ahead.
I have a different anecdote for you. I went to Lowell High School in San Francisco, which is merit-based. So what you get is white kids and East Asian kids, not even Southeast Asian kids. So the idea of it sounds cool, but like how you actually implement it, like how do you measure cultural fit? Like all these different things are real squishy. Like if you just go to the metrics, it may or may not create the outcomes that you want. I think it could be one thing and a set of tools, but I think maybe just thinking that that's the ultimate hack for it, maybe might work. I don't know enough, but it sounds like it's not enough.
And there's a question in the back. Yes.
Hi, actually it's more of a comment. Sorry. So the Clayton Institute for Gender Research, we do all this work on gender bias in the workplace. And when it comes to the question of meritocracy, study shows that when it's framed in meritocracy logic, it doesn't address disparities. And actually it makes it worse. And so a couple comments. So one, when it comes to recruiting, studies show the best way to even out the playing field is a blind recruitment process. Get rid of school, get rid of race, get rid of gender, because that's going to up your numbers. And in terms of, I love the fact that you brought up universities, because anecdote that ties into this larger conversation, people ask me, why didn't you look at diversity in schools? I was like, the research on education and diversity is very clear on what works to keep students of color, first generation students, in schools. Mm-hmm. It's the cultural centers, it's the networks. and they're very useful. The thing is that model has not been translated into the workplace. And so yes, we talk about ERGs, but ERGs is one piece of the puzzle that sometimes isn't valued in the workplace to begin with. So then people of color have to make the decision. Do I engage? The next piece about networks, studies also show that when you hire minorities in large cohorts, they're actually more likely to stay at companies than they are to leave. Sure. So the question is how do you hire critical mass in the beginning, and how do you create the programming to keep them there? Because that's what happens is they'll get hired, they face all these biases, all these forms of microaggressions, and then they leave because they don't want to get mistreated.
So do we need to have management programs within tech companies as opposed to just recruitment programs, given the fact that Asian women are definitely represented statistically in large corporations? So do we need, within those corporations, management programs specifically designed to say, hey, we're going to take 20% of our Asian female employee population and push them through a management program and see how many people we can get into middle management and upper management. Any other questions before we wrap? Yes, one last question here by the plant.
Can I address the point on merit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Quickly, because I think that the narrative of merit-based anything, it actually can be false confidence in the organization's ability. So, I mean, Singapore is the ultimate meritocratic society. We like to say we're totally meritocratic. It's based on performance. You know, people tend to overestimate the impact of, you know, when you succeed, I think research shows that you always say, I did it. And I think that actually runs against this idea that you do need to make special effort for minorities.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just because I work for Google, I guess. I think the goal of the program, we have a massive program. We have unconscious bias. Everyone needs to take it, so that you are aware of your bias, whatever it is, good or bad. Like agent, diligent might be a bias, right? And then we have bias busting, because after you are conscious, you don't know how to bust the bias, right? So then we have that, and then we have a management training for the managing an inclusive team. So the goal is inclusion. Like goal is inclusion, and meaning that everyone needs to feel like they can bring their full self to work. We have other target. Like we try to put diversity, like interviewer in our panel all the time. You know, like we have all those interview training and everything, and we also go out to the school trying to look for the minority candidates, right? But I think the goal is inclusion. No matter who they are, they have to be like safe. They have to feel comfortable. So I think we can talk about merit too, but I think the goal is for each individual management to make sure that culture is inclusive. So that's what I think.
And our final question.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Sanfranca. I work for Wells Fargo. Tina, you mentioned the motherhood penalty, and that kind of really struck me because I am a mother of 3. So at one point, I was a young mother at one point, and I was kind of the first one of my larger team to have children, and I went from a 12-hour day to a very much more manageable time. And then when my first child was 2 or 3, more of the women that worked for me at the time, they started to have children as well, and they told me that I was their role model, and my jaw dropped because I was young at that point, and there was no one else to represent this mother that pumped her breast milk and went to work and was successful. And so in my mind I started, okay, I want to form some sort of mother support group, but how do I convert that to a bashing and complaining group to a supportive, keep these women pipeline and keep them moving along? What are your thoughts on that, and how do we move that forward?
I think part of the problem is the Asian American community buys into this model minority myth, and we try to play it both ways, right? On good days, we're like, oh, I'm Asian, you should hire me, I'm good at math, I'm not gonna make trouble, right? And then on a bad day, you're like, oh, I'm being mistreated because I have leadership potential and you can't see it, right? So you cannot play it both ways, okay? And for me, I'm an intersectional feminist. I always look at race in addition to gender. So for me, I'm like, okay, that's fine, but are you standing in solidarity with your Black and brown brothers and sisters, with your LGBT community? When someone else is being mistreated, are you standing up? Are you using the power that you have to make a change, right? So for me, I think the way to do it is just to make friends. I mean, just wherever you can, right? And network and build coalitions with other ERG groups, right? It's not additive, it's actually multiplicative. So if you create relationships, it's like it just has this effect of changing dynamics in the culture and the tone. So for me, you know, the reason why Mother Coders hasn't honed in on a specific demographic, not on race, not on income, is because I feel like motherhood is such a huge penalty, such a huge issue that I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. And funders have a very hard time, like, well, why do you work with these moms, you know, across the board when they don't really need the help? It's like, because moms in general need these policies changed in order to thrive. And hats off to you for being the example, because I know that being a VP at a major, major bank, it's probably your effect, the effect that you've had goes beyond the women in your team. So thank you for doing that.
Great. And with that, thank you so much to all of you. It's been an awesome discussion. Thanks for getting up so early and being here for breakfast. We really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your day.